Tone is a complicated subject. I mean, there's a lot of variables that affect tone, from your guitar to your amp to your pickups and your pedals. Now, I've been playing guitar for 20 years, so I know exactly how to get the tone that I want out of my equipment. But as a beginner, you might not have that knowledge. That's what this video is for. Now, I'm not going to tell you what your guitar should sound like. I'm not going to define what the best possible tone should be or anything like that, because tone is such a subjective topic. What I am going to do is I'm going to go through every piece of equipment and I'm going to show you how each item affects tone. Now, I'm going to be doing this in order of signal, so we'll start with strings. Strings have a lot of variables. I mean, we can talk about how they're wound, what they're made of, the brand, but for the purposes of this video, I want to focus on gauge. These are 10s. But what does that even mean? I mean, what do I mean when I talk about 10s or 11s or 9s? I'm actually talking about the gauge of the high E string. See, all of the strings in this pack have different gauges, but as guitarists, we only refer to the thinnest string as a sort of shorthand. Now, if you're wondering what the measuring unit is, it's 1/1000th of an inch. The thinner the strings, the higher the tone, and the thicker the strings, the lower the tone. Now, 10s are my favorite gauge, but if you wanted a darker tone, you could use 11s or 12s, and if you wanted a lighter tone, you could use 9s or 8s. By the way, change your strings regularly. You'd be surprised how much difference a fresh set of strings can make. One pro tip I can give you has to do with tuning and intonation. Now, intonation, when you break it down, is really just the string length between the bridge and the nut. If you don't know how to set your own intonation, that's totally cool. A lot of guitarists don't. Do yourself a favor and find a guitar tech who can help you out. Oh, and nobody likes to listen to a badly tuned guitar. Whether you're using an electric tuner like this one, or your phone, or your ear, just make sure you're accurate. Another thing to check is your pickups, to make sure that they're set correctly. Badly aligned pickups can make tone adjustment very difficult. If a pickup is badly angled, like say the top is a little too close to the strings, you're going to get a lot of bass tone and not too much treble, which means you're going to be fighting against that whenever you adjust your tone. And let's also remember there's a difference between your bridge pickup and your neck pickup. Bridge pickups are brighter, sharper, and more piercing because they're meant for rhythm. Neck pickups are warmer, thicker, and darker because they're meant for lead. Your guitar has a pickup selector for a reason. Maybe you should start using it more often. Next in the signal order is the tone knob. Now, the thing to remember about the tone knob is that it only adjusts the higher frequencies. So if your guitar is sounding way too bassy, turning up the tone knob is not necessarily going to fix the problem. Whenever I'm setting up with a new amp or a new system, I'll always set my tone knob right in the middle because I can always make an adjustment later on if I need to. I'm only going to touch on pedals in this video because I've got to be honest with you, I'm no expert. I use a multi-effects pedal system. And what I can say is that the more pedals you have, the harder it is to get decent tone. My advice, try a pedal by itself before adding it to your setup. Play around with it and see if you like it. Honestly, it's going to take time to get used to all the different kinds of effects pedals out there. Now, if you don't have much money and you can't afford to buy lots of different pedals to try them out, I'd use YouTube. YouTube has so many product reviews, making it an excellent resource for listening to all sorts of different effects. Bottom line is, the more pedals you listen to, the easier it will get for you to be able to figure out what you like and what you don't like. My pro tip here, especially for people just starting out, simpler is better. Let's talk about our amplifier. Now, I really want to just focus on the EQs here. This here is where I do the majority of my adjustments. When setting your EQ, I like to start with everything neatly in the middle to begin with, then I'll adjust. Now, for solo playing, I like my treble and bass a little higher than my mids. It helps to give a more well-rounded sound. If I'm playing in a band, it's a completely different situation, which I'll explain in a minute. I generally prefer to adjust down rather than up. This is important. So if I'm sounding a little too tinny, I will drop my treble a little bit rather than adding more bass. If I'm sounding too dark and bassy, I will drop my bass a little bit rather than just adding more treble. Now, this of course does depend on your settings. If your bass is at 3 and your treble is at 1, it's going to be better to raise your treble a little bit rather than dropping the bass even more. If your guitar sounds too thin, you can turn up the mids. And if it's too muddy, you can try lowering the mids to see if that helps. This is another situation where you're just going to have to spend time experimenting and adjusting and taking notes of how the sound changes. Let's talk about setting up your tone for a band. One mistake I've noticed amongst beginners playing in a band for the first time is a guitar sound that just has too much bass. Remember, you don't want to be competing with the bass guitarist in the lower frequencies. And you don't want to be competing with the keyboards in the higher frequencies either. You want to be right in the middle. So I tend to adjust my bass rather low if there's a bass guitarist on stage. I tend to have my mids a little higher than my treble and bass. Now it should be noted that this is personal preference. I primarily perform folk and blues music, so this is just what sounds good to me, but it may not be what sounds good to you. Experiment. The final point I'd like to make has to do with how you actually play. You need to be listening to what your bandmates are doing. I'll just throw out a few examples. If your pianist is playing in the higher registry, it doesn't really make sense for me to be playing in the same octave. Better for me to play in a lower range. It would make even less sense for me to start riffing in the lower string while our bass guitarist plays a solo. The guitar is such a versatile instrument. Some of the best advice I've ever been given when I was young and arrogant was to stay in my lane and don't step on toes. Tone is such a complex subject, and I really hope that this video has helped serve as kind of an introduction for you. There's loads more information out there, and I highly recommend you keep studying. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.